The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden podium like a gunshot, and Bessie Bancroft felt the sound travel all the way through her chest, hollowing her out from the inside as the only home she had ever known was called out to the highest bidder. It was the spring of 1882, and the town of Harlan Creek, Texas, sat baking under a merciless April sun that had already cracked the red earth in a dozen places along the main road. The town was not large: a general store, a livery, a church whose white paint was peeling at every corner, two saloons that faced each other across the street like old enemies who had grown too tired to fight, and a bank that had been there just long enough to ruin half the county. The surrounding land was rolling and golden, broken by cedar and mesquite, and on the eastern edge of town, 3 miles out along Cottonwood Creek, sat the 240 acres that had been the Bancroft land since Bessie's father had claimed it in 1859. Her father was dead. Her mother, Clara Bancroft, had been dead 11 months now, taken by a fever that the traveling doctor had called pneumonia, and that Bessie had simply called cruel. And since Clara's death, Bessie had been fighting a battle she had not known existed until a man in a black coat had ridden up to the farmhouse one October morning and handed her a notice from the Harlan Creek Savings and Trust. The land had a lien on it. A lien Bessie had never known about, signed 3 years before her mother's death, when Clara had been desperate for money to pay for Bessie's younger brother Thomas to see a proper surgeon in San Antonio for his leg. Thomas had lived, though he walked with a cane now. The land had been pledged as collateral and the bank had been patient, extending the debt twice. But the bank's patience, it turned out, had an expiration date, and that date was the first Monday in April 1882. Bessie had done everything she could think to do. She had written letters. She had taken the stage to the county seat and sat in the hallway of a lawyer's office for 3 hours, only to be told that the lien was legitimate and the debt was owed. She had sold her mother's good silver. She had sold her father's watch. She had taken in laundry from the hotel and sewing from Mrs. Prewitt and every other woman in town who would give it to her, working by candlelight until her fingers went numb. She had borrowed every cent she could from her friend Dora Calloway, who ran the millinery shop, and it had not been enough. Not nearly enough. The debt was $412. The land was worth $2,000, maybe more, if someone wanted it badly enough. So she had stood before Judge Elias Corbett and signed the papers that allowed the bank to put the land up for public auction, because the judge had looked at her with something that might have been sympathy, and said it was the only way to guarantee that any surplus from the sale would come back to her. If the land sold for more than the debt, she would receive the difference. It was, the judge said, the best she could hope for. Bessie Bancroft was 23 years old, had not slept well in 11 months, and had been told by 3 different men in 3 different offices that the best she could hope for was standing on the steps of the Harlan Creek courthouse, watching strangers bid on her mother's roses. She stood very straight because her mother had always stood very straight, and she wore her good blue dress that was only a little faded, and she did not cry because she had made herself a promise the night before that she would not cry in public. Not today. She could cry later, out at the creek where nobody would see her, where she had cried every other grief of her life. Today she would stand straight. There were perhaps 30 people gathered in the dusty street before the courthouse steps. Some of them she knew. Old Harlan Peaks from the feed store, who had known her father. The Donner brothers, ranchers from the north end of the county who already had more land than they needed and seemed to be here mostly out of curiosity. Reverend Marsh from the church, who stood at the edge of the crowd with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. She saw Dora standing to her left, dark-eyed and furious on Bessie's behalf, gripping a handkerchief she had already twisted almost in 2. And there were strangers she did not know, men who had ridden in from elsewhere, drawn by the notice that had been posted in the county paper and in 2 neighboring towns. Land on Cottonwood Creek. Good water. Good grass. The kind of land that drew men like moths to a lamp. The auctioneer was a thin man named Perkins who worked for the bank and seemed to take no particular pleasure in his job. Or perhaps he took too much and had learned to hide it. He read out the particulars in a flat, practiced voice, and the crowd shifted and murmured and the bidding began. Bessie had thought she was prepared. She was not prepared. The numbers climbed with a casualness that made her feel sick, as though her mother's land were a horse at a stock auction, assessed and turned and found acceptable. The Donner brothers dropped out at 600. A rancher she didn't know dropped out at 750. The bidding slowed and then steadied between two men she had never seen before, a heavy-set man in a brown suit who kept mopping his face with a handkerchief, and a man who stood very still at the back of the crowd and had not moved once since the auction began. She had noticed the still man when the crowd first gathered, the way you notice something that doesn't quite fit the frame. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, wearing a plain brown canvas coat over a dark shirt and a hat that had seen weather. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two more, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red cedar that grew along the creek, and dark eyes that were fixed on the auctioneer with an expression of quiet attention. He had not spoken to anyone. He had not fidgeted. He had simply stood there, hands easy at his sides, and waited. He bid last and he bid clean, and the heavy-set man in the brown suit looked at him and seemed to consider, and then wiped his face one more time and shook his head. "Sold," the auctioneer said. $1,100 to the gentleman at the back. The gavel fell. Bessie felt the sound in her chest again, different this time, not hollow exactly, but final, like a door closing on a room she had lived in her whole life. She pressed her lips together and kept her chin up, because she had promised herself, and around her the crowd was already dispersing the way crowds do when the spectacle is over, drifting back toward their ordinary mornings. Perkins from the bank came to her with a leather folder and a pen, and she signed where he pointed without reading the words because her eyes were not working quite right, and he told her the surplus after the debt was paid would come to $688, and that she could collect it from the bank by Thursday. She nodded and thanked him because her mother had raised her to be polite, even when politeness felt like a betrayal of everything she was actually feeling. She was turning to find Dora when she heard a voice behind her. "Miss Bancroft." It was a low voice, unhurried, with a quality she couldn't name immediately, something careful in it, like a man who had learned to choose his words because he understood their weight. She turned. It was the still man from the back of the crowd. Up close, he was even more quietly composed than he had seemed from a distance. His hat was off now, held in both hands, and his dark hair was slightly damp at his temples from the heat. His eyes, she saw, were not quite brown. They were something between brown and amber, the color of creek water in late afternoon. "I'm Clement Hartwell," he said. "I want to talk to you if you'll allow it. Not here, somewhere you're comfortable." "Wherever you'd like." Bessie looked at him. She was aware of Dora coming up beside her, aware of the assessment in Dora's gaze, and she straightened her spine a little more and said, "You just bought my mother's land, Mr. Hartwell. I'm not sure what we have to talk about." "More than you might think," he said, and there was no guile in it, no performance. He said it the way a man states a plain fact. She studied him for a moment. He met her gaze steadily and without challenge, the way a person looks at you when they have nothing to hide and no reason to pretend otherwise. "Dora's place," she said at last. "The millinery. 1 hour." He nodded once, put his hat back on, and walked away. Bessie watched him go, and Dora grabbed her arm and whispered, "Who in the Lord's creation is that man?" And Bessie said, "I have absolutely no idea," and meant it in more ways than one. Dora Calloway's millinery shop was narrow and warm and smelled of ribbon and cedar, and it had a small back room with 2 chairs and a table where Dora conducted what she called her private business, which mostly meant fitting hats for the wives of important men who didn't want to be seen buying hats in public for reasons Dora had never been able to fully explain to Bessie. The back room had a window that looked onto the alley, and a small iron stove that Dora kept burning even in spring because she was constitutionally cold. And it was there that Bessie sat when Clement Hartwell appeared in the doorway exactly 1 hour later. Dora brought coffee without being asked, which Bessie appreciated, and then positioned herself at a small work table in the corner in a way that made clear she intended to remain, which Bessie also appreciated. Clement Hartwell sat down across from Bessie, turned the coffee cup once in his hands, and looked at her directly. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond because the beginning of it is going to sound strange." "All right," Bessie said. "I didn't come to this auction to buy land," he said. "I came because I heard about it secondhand from a man at a bar in Uvalde who was talking about a parcel on Cottonwood Creek in Harlan County, and the way he talked about it, the way he described what was happening to the family who owned it, something about it sat wrong with me. I rode 3 days to get here." Bessie set her coffee cup down. "You rode 3 days?" "Yes, because something sat wrong with you." "Yes." She looked at him. He held her gaze. "That's a long way to ride on a feeling," she said. "It is," he agreed. "But I grew up watching my family lose land, my father's farm in Missouri when I was 11 years old. The bank took it the same way, debt and a lien and an auction and a crowd of strangers bidding on the thing that was the center of your whole life. I know what that looks like from the inside." Bessie was quiet. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me," he continued. "I'm telling you because I want you to understand why I'm here and what I intend to do." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, and he set it on the table between them, and he slid it toward her. "That's the deed," he said. "It was just registered at the county office this morning. My name is on it right now." Bessie looked at the paper and did not touch it. "I want to sign it back to you," he said. "I want to give you the land back." The room went very still. Dora's ribbon and thread sound stopped. Outside, a horse went by in the street. The stove ticked. Bessie said, "Why?" It was not a question exactly. It was the word stripped of everything but its meaning. "Because it's yours," he said. "It was always yours. You paid over $1,000 for it." "I did. You don't know me." "No," he agreed. "Then I don't understand," Bessie said, and her voice was steady because she was working very hard to keep it that way. "What you want in return." Something moved in his expression, not offense, not surprise, but something more like recognition, as though he had expected exactly this question and respected it for being asked. "Nothing," he said. "Not a single thing. No debt. No agreement. No obligation of any kind. I'll sign this deed back to you today, and I'll ride back to wherever I'm going, and you'll never have to think about me again." Bessie looked at the deed. She looked at the man. She had learned in 23 years, and especially in the past 11 months, to be careful about things that seemed too simple when they should have been complicated. "What do you do, Mr. Hartwell?" she asked. "For a living? How does a man ride 3 days and spend $1,000 on land for a stranger?" He considered the question with the same honest attention he had given everything else. "I've done a lot of things," he said. "Drove cattle for 4 years. Worked as a hand on a spread near Abilene. Saved, made some good decisions and some bad ones. I have money enough for what I need." A pause. "I'm not a rich man, but I paid for what I bought fairly. And you want to give it away." "I want to put it right," he said. "There's a difference." Dora made a small sound from the corner that might have been anything. Bessie picked up the deed. She unfolded it carefully, and her eyes moved over the language, and there was her mother's land described in the official prose of the county recorder, 240 acres along Cottonwood Creek, and Clement Hartwell's name where her mother's name had been. She folded it again and set it back on the table. "I'll need 3 days," she said. "I want to take this to the lawyer in the county seat and have him look at it before I accept anything." "That's exactly what you should do," Clement said. "And I want to know that this is genuinely what you say it is, with no strings attached, before I sign anything." "Also exactly right." She studied him one more time. "Where will you be in 3 days?" "Wherever you need me to be," he said. And then, with a slight gravity, "I'll take a room at the boarding house." Bessie stood and he stood, and they shook hands across the small table, and his hand was warm and calloused and completely steady, and she thought, not for the first time that day, that she had absolutely no idea what to make of Clement Hartwell. She thought about it for the rest of that day, and through the night, lying in the small room she rented from Mrs. Garrett on Pine Street, staring at the ceiling where a water stain had been slowly expanding since winter. She thought about what kind of man does something like that, and she could not come up with a satisfying answer, which troubled her and interested her in equal measure. She took the stage to the county seat the next morning. The lawyer's name was Aldrich, and he was a square-built man with spectacles and the deliberate manner of someone who had learned to be thorough because carelessness was expensive. He read the deed and the transfer documents that Clement had also provided, and he read them twice, and then he looked at Bessie over his spectacles and said the paperwork appeared to be entirely legitimate, and that if Mr. Hartwell signed a quitclaim deed transferring the property back to her, the land would be hers free and clear of all prior encumbrances, since the bank debt had been satisfied by the auction proceeds. Free and clear. Bessie sat with those words for the rest of the stage ride home, 2 words that had not applied to a single thing in her life for the past 3 years. She found Clement Hartwell on the evening of the 3rd day, as arranged, at the small table in the corner of the Harlan Creek General Store, where Mr. Huang, a Chinese shopkeeper, who had come west with the railroad and stayed because Harlan Creek had needed a good general store more than the railroad had needed another laborer, kept 3 mismatched chairs for customers who wanted to sit a spell. Clement was there with a cup of coffee, reading a newspaper, and he stood when she came in, and she thought again that there was something in the way he moved that was deliberate and unhurried, the way a man moves when he is comfortable in his own skin. "The lawyer says it's real," she said. "It is. He says if you sign the quitclaim, the land is mine without condition." "That's right." She set the papers on the table. He sat down and she sat across from him, and he read what she'd brought from Aldrich's office, and he signed where Aldrich had marked, and she witnessed it, and it was done in less time than it took to drink the coffee Mr. Huang brought without asking. When it was over, Bessie looked at the deed in her hands and felt something she had not felt in so long that she almost didn't recognize it. Relief, yes, but something deeper than relief. Something closer to the feeling of walking into a room and finding, against all probability, that something precious had been returned to its place. She looked up at Clement, who was folding the extra papers neatly, not looking at her, giving her the moment without watching it, and she felt a sharp and unexpected warmth for him that surprised her. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. He looked up then, and his expression was quiet and direct. "You don't need to." "I do, though." She paused. "Will you have dinner with me? Tonight. Mrs. Garrett cooks on Thursdays, and she always makes enough for company, and I would like to do at least that much." He was still for a moment, and then something shifted in his expression, something just faintly warmer. "I'd be glad to," he said. Mrs. Garrett's table was a long oak affair that seated 8 and usually held 4, and that Thursday it held Bessie, Clement, Mrs. Garrett herself, and old Mr. Finn from the room at the end of the hall, who was a retired schoolteacher and couldn't resist a populated dinner table. Mrs. Garrett served roasted chicken and cornbread and green beans that had been put up in the fall, and apple pie that was better than anything Bessie had tasted in months, and Mr. Finn talked about history in the enthusiastic way of a man whose audience was usually just himself, and Clement listened to him with genuine interest and asked good questions, and Mrs. Garrett watched Clement with the measuring look she applied to all men within proximity of Bessie, and Bessie sat across the table and watched Clement Hartwell be exactly who he had seemed to be in Dora's back room, without performance or variation, and found that she liked it very much. After dinner, they sat on Mrs. Garrett's porch because the evening was warm and smelled of cedar, and the first hint of bluebonnets from the field at the edge of town, and they talked. Not about the land, not about the auction, but about other things, about Missouri and Texas and cattle drives, and what the sky looks like from the back of a horse at 3 in the morning when the stars are out, about her mother's roses and his mother's garden, and how grief sits differently on different people, about what a person does with a fresh start when they finally get one. They talked for 2 hours on that porch, and when Clement finally stood to go, he held out his hand and she shook it, and he said, "I'm glad I rode those 3 days, Miss Bancroft." And she said, "So am I, Mr. Hartwell," and she meant it in a way that had nothing to do with the land. He had said he would ride on once the deed was settled, and yet the next morning he was still there. She saw him at the livery, talking to the man who ran it, a weathered Tejano named Roberto Garza who knew horses better than anyone else in Harlan County. She didn't stop, but she noticed, and she noticed that she noticed. That afternoon, she borrowed Dora's horse and rode out to the farm for the first time in weeks. She hadn't been able to bring herself to go during the weeks leading up to the auction, when it had seemed as if going would only make everything worse. But now the deed was folded in her pocket, and the land was hers again, and she needed to see it. She rode through the front gate and along the lane under the old cottonwood trees that gave the creek its name, and the farmhouse came into view, white-painted and faded, the porch slightly tilted on the east end where the post had settled, the garden beside the kitchen door overgrown now but still showing the shape of her mother's planting. The roses were coming in despite everything, because roses, Bessie's mother had always said, do not require permission. She stood in the yard and looked at the house and the barn and the old pecan tree where her brother Thomas had broken his arm at age 7 trying to act like a squirrel, and she breathed in the smell of the land cedar and red dirt and the faint sweetness of water from the creek. And she thought about what it meant to have a home returned to you, and whether she deserved it, and how she could possibly earn what Clement Hartwell had done. She heard a horse on the lane and turned to find Clement Hartwell riding toward her at a walk, and she felt something that was not quite surprise and not quite the opposite of it. He pulled up and looked at her and then looked at the farm. "I thought I'd ride out," he said. "Wanted to see it properly since I held the deed for 3 days. A beat. If that's all right." "It's your 3 days," she said. "Come on." She showed him the farm the way she would have shown anyone who had earned the showing, the creek where it bent south around the big rock, the spring that never went dry even in the worst drought years, the south pasture where the grass came in thick and good, the apple orchard her father had planted that was just beginning to blossom. She told him about the land the way you tell someone about a thing you love, with detail, and with the specific memories that make detail into meaning. He listened the way he listened to everything, with full attention and without interruption, and asked the occasional question that told her he understood farming and land and the relationship between a family and the ground it grew from. They rode the whole perimeter in the long afternoon light, and when they came back to the farmhouse and dismounted, he looked at it for a moment and said, "It's a good piece of land. Your family built something real here." "My mother built most of it," Bessie said. "After my father died, she ran this place herself, 12 years. She paused. She was remarkable." "So is her daughter," he said, and then looked away, as though the words had come out more than he intended, and she felt the warmth of them land somewhere in her chest and stay. That evening, before he rode back to town, he stood beside his horse and turned his hat in his hands, which she was beginning to understand was something he did when he was working out how to say a thing he wanted to say accurately. "I'm thinking about staying in Harlan Creek for a while," he said, "if you have no objection." She looked at him. "Why would I object? It's a small town," he said. "People notice things. People in small towns will notice things whether you stay or go," she said. "And you spent $1,000 putting my mother's land back in my hands. I don't think I'm the person who should be telling you to leave." Something in his face relaxed just slightly. "Then I'll stay a while." He stayed a week, and then another. He took on work at Roberto Garza's livery because he was good with horses and Garza needed someone reliable, and seemed to assess Clement in about 30 seconds and decide he was exactly that. He did not crowd Bessie, did not appear on her doorstep, did not seem to expect any particular thing from her. but he was there in the way that good people are there, steadily and without agenda, and she found herself looking for him in the ordinary geography of the town. She began going back out to the farm, which had sat empty since her mother's death and before that was barely managed because Bessie had been working constantly just to try to pay the bank. There was so much to do. The porch post needed resetting. 2 windows needed glazing. The kitchen garden needed clearing and planting. The barn needed a new door hinge, and the far pasture fence had gone down in a winter storm. On the second Saturday after the auction, Clement appeared at the farm at 8 in the morning with a bag of tools and said, "I can set that post, if you'll tell me where you keep the post hole digger." And Bessie, who was on the porch with a cup of coffee and a list of repairs that was slightly longer than her arm, looked at him for a moment and then said, "It's in the barn, 3rd wall from the left." And that was how it began. They worked side by side through the cool spring mornings. Clement on the structural repairs because he understood them, Bessie on the garden and the house because she understood those, and sometimes together on the things that needed 2 people. And the work was comfortable in the way that working with someone can be comfortable when both people know what they're doing and neither one needs to prove it. They talked while they worked, and the talking was easy and good, and Bessie found herself saying things she hadn't said out loud to anyone. About her mother, about her father, about Thomas in San Antonio, and how guilty she felt sometimes about the land having been leveraged for his surgery, even though of course she didn't begrudge Thomas his leg. "You don't have to apologize for loving your brother," Clement said one afternoon from the top of a ladder where he was rehanging a shutter that had come loose in the wind. "I know," she said, "but I think about it. Your mother knew what she was doing when she signed that paper," he said. "She was choosing her child over her collateral. That's not a choice to be ashamed of." Bessie was quiet for a moment, turning a trowel in her hands. "Did your mother, when your family lost the farm, did she have a choice like that?" He came down the ladder, slow and careful, and set the hammer on the railing and looked out at the pasture. "Not really," he said. "Ours was just bad luck and bad timing and a man at the bank who didn't care about either. There was no noble purpose to it." A pause. That was the part that made it so hard to carry. She looked at his profile. The set jaw, the steady gaze directed somewhere in the middle distance. The weight of the thing he was carrying that he didn't dramatize, just held. "That's why you came," she said, "when you heard about our auction." "It's part of why," he said. He turned then and looked at her, and the afternoon sun was full on his face, and she could see the exactness of his expression, which was honest and a little bit careful. "The other part is harder to explain." "Try," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "The man in the bar in Uvalde," he said, "he mentioned the girl who owned the land. Said she'd been fighting the bank for months, working herself to the bone, trying everything she could think of. He said it as a kind of sad story, a local tragedy, a thing that happens. And I don't know exactly why. I'd heard 100 stories like that, but something about the way he described her. Proud, he said. He said she stood in that courthouse and didn't argue or beg or make a scene, just stood straight as a fence post and signed her name and kept her head up. He said it like that made her more pathetic than if she'd broken down." He paused. "I didn't think it made her pathetic at all." Bessie did not say anything for a long time. "You rode 3 days," she said at last quietly. "I did." The evening birds were starting in the cottonwoods, and the light was going golden and long across the pasture. And she thought about a stranger in a bar in Uvalde hearing a second-hand story about a woman he'd never met, and deciding it wasn't right and saddling his horse and riding 3 days to do something about it. And she thought that she had been wrong when she told herself she didn't know what to make of Clement Hartwell. She was beginning to know exactly what to make of him. The understanding of it was as clear and solid as the red earth under her feet. "You should stay for dinner," she said. "I found my mother's bean soup recipe." He looked at her, and the careful quality in his expression gave way to something simpler. "I'd like that," he said. The weeks that followed were among the most unexpectedly full of Bessie's recent life. The farm was coming back. The porch was level. The windows were glazed. The garden was in beans and squash and tomatoes and the herbs her mother had always kept along the south fence. The roses were blooming now, a deep red variety her mother had called by a French name that Bessie could never pronounce correctly, and they came in so vigorously along the front fence that Mrs. Pruitt, who drove past on her way to town one morning, stopped her buggy to stare. Clement was at the farm most mornings. He had taken on more work from Garza, who had offered him steady pay and a small room above the livery, and he spent his afternoons there, but his mornings were for Cottonwood Creek, and Bessie had stopped pretending that she didn't look for his horse on the lane when she woke up. One morning in early May, she was planting the last of the tomato seedlings when she heard him come through the gate and turned to see him carrying something in a cloth sack. He set it on the porch steps and she came over to see, and it was a ceramic pot with a rosemary plant in it, healthy and dark green and smelling of summer. Roberto's wife had it going spare, he said a little self-consciously. I thought your mother might have had rosemary. Bessie looked at the pot and felt something move through her that was too large for the gift but was perfectly fitted to the intention behind it. She did, she said. She had it right here. She pointed to the corner of the porch. Right here in a pot exactly like this. He nodded and picked up the pot and set it in the corner, and then stood back and looked at it. And she looked at it too, and neither of them said anything, and it was exactly the right kind of silence. She made coffee and they sat on the porch steps, which they had taken to doing in the mornings when the work was going well. And he told her about a letter he'd gotten from his sister in Missouri, and she told him about a letter from Thomas, who was doing well in San Antonio and had found work as a bookkeeper, and was, apparently, courting a girl named Harriet who Thomas described in 3 full pages with the kind of exhaustive detail that only a man who has never been in love before can generate. He sounds happy, Clement said. He does, she said. I'm glad, a pause. I was worried about him after the auction. I wrote and told him what happened, what I had to do. He felt terrible. He offered to come back, to sell his furniture, to do anything he could. What did you tell him? I told him to stay put and take Harriet to a proper supper and stop feeling guilty about a choice our mother made for love. Clement looked at her sideways with that faintly warmer expression that she had come to recognize as the closest he came to a full smile without tipping all the way over. That was a kind thing to say. It was also the true thing, she said, which makes it easier. He was quiet for a moment. Then, how are you finding it, being back here, living in the house again? She had moved back to the farmhouse 2 weeks ago, once the most urgent repairs were done and the place felt habitable again. It had felt strange at first, sleeping in the house without her mother in it, cooking at the stove without her mother's voice in the background. But it was beginning to feel right again, slowly, the way a joint settles after a dislocation, tender and careful but finding its way. Strange, she said honestly. And good, both at the same time. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I keep finding things, her receipts for seeds in the kitchen drawer. The quilt she was working on folded in the chest at the end of the bed. I finished it. She paused. I was never as good with a needle as she was. I'm sure she'd disagree, he said. She'd be diplomatically incorrect, Bessie said, and he laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and she heard it and thought about it after he'd gone, the way you think about a sound you want to keep. Dora Calloway had opinions about all of this, as Dora had opinions about most things. She expressed them over tea on a Wednesday afternoon in the millinery back room, with the directness of a woman who loved Bessie too much to be circumspect. He is at your farm every morning, Dora said. He helps with repairs, Bessie said. He brought you a rosemary plant. His foreman's wife had it going spare. Bessie. Dora set down her teacup. The man rode 3 days and spent $1,000 on your behalf. I know that. What are you doing? Working on my farm, Bessie said. Having conversation, being grateful. Are you being deliberately dense or does it come naturally? Bessie looked at her friend and felt the truth of what she wasn't saying. I don't know what he wants, she said. He said he wanted nothing in return. Maybe he wants what's in front of him, Dora said. Maybe he just hasn't said it yet. Then he should say it, Bessie said, and then heard herself and picked up her teacup. Dora watched her with satisfaction. There it is, she said. What Bessie did not tell Dora, what she was still working out how to say even to herself, was that the question of what Clement Hartwell wanted had been gradually, over these weeks, becoming less important than the question of what she wanted. And the answer to that question was becoming clearer every morning on the porch steps with a coffee cup and the sound of the birds in the cottonwoods, and a man who listened with his full attention and remembered the small things she said, and set a rosemary plant in exactly the right corner of the porch. The trouble came, as trouble tends to in small towns, from a direction she hadn't expected. His name was Boyd Crenshaw, and he was the son of Dale Crenshaw, who owned a considerable amount of land north of Harlan Creek, and who had wanted for years to expand south toward Cottonwood Creek and its dependable water supply. Bessie had been aware of Dale Crenshaw's interest in her mother's land. He had made an offer to Clara Bancroft twice in the years before her death, both times politely declined, and she had assumed that with the land back in her hands and the bank debt cleared, the matter was settled. She had not accounted for Boyd Crenshaw, who was 28 and had his father's acquisitiveness without his father's manners. He appeared at the farm one Thursday morning in mid-May, riding up the lane without an invitation, and Bessie came out on the porch to find him dismounting with the kind of confidence that belongs to men who have rarely been told no. "Miss Bancroft," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Heard you've got the land back. Quite a thing." He looked around the property with a proprietorial air that made Bessie's jaw tighten. "My father would like to make you an offer. Fair price. You'd be comfortable for a long while." "I'm not interested in selling," Bessie said. "Now, don't be hasty." He stepped up toward the porch. "You've got a lot of land here for one woman to manage alone. My father's offer would more than set you up." "I'm not alone," Bessie said, "and the land isn't for sale." Boyd looked at her with an expression that suggested he was merely biding time. "Think it over," he said. "My father's patient." "Good morning, Mr. Crenshaw," she said, which was a dismissal, and he seemed to weigh whether to push it further, and then evidently decided against it, and he mounted and rode away. She was still standing on the porch, jaw still tight, when Clement appeared around the side of the barn. He had arrived before Boyd had come up the lane, and had apparently decided not to involve himself in a conversation that was hers to have. He came to the porch and looked at her. "You heard that," she said. "I did. He'll come back." "Probably," he agreed. "I meant what I said. The land isn't for sale." "I know you did." He came up the porch steps and looked at her with that steady attention, and she felt suddenly, standing there in the morning sun with her hands clasped tight in front of her, that she wanted to say more than she knew how to say. "I'm not afraid of him," she said. "I know you're not," he said. "But I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever that means or doesn't mean, I'm here." The words were simple, and they were carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested, and she felt them settle in her chest with a warmth that was no longer new but was deepening, becoming something she could not any more pretend was simply gratitude. She looked at him. He looked back. "Clement," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "Yes," he said. "Why are you still here?" He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man who doesn't know the answer, but of a man who is deciding how precisely to give it. "Because I don't want to be anywhere else," he said. "Because every morning when I ride down that lane, it feels like riding towards something real, and I haven't felt that in a long time." A pause. "Because of you." Bessie took a breath and let it out slowly. "I think about you," she said, "considerably. I have since the day you sat across that table in Dora's back room and told me you wanted nothing in return for what you'd done, because nobody does that. Nobody does something like that and wants nothing." "I said nothing," he said. "I didn't say I wanted nothing." The distinction landed with a precision that made her heart do something quick and unpredictable. "What did you want?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment with the full, careful attention he brought to everything, and then he said, "To see what kind of woman stood straight under that gavel and kept her chin up, and whether she was as remarkable as a stranger in a bar made her sound." And, she said, "You are," he said simply. "You are considerably more remarkable." Bessie felt heat come up in her face that had nothing to do with the May sun, and she looked away briefly at the rosemary in its pot in the corner of the porch, because she needed something to look at that was not his face. "We should get to work," she said. "We should," he agreed. But she was smiling as she went down the porch steps, and she felt his gaze on her back as she went, warm and steady, and she didn't mind it at all. Boyd Crenshaw came back, as expected. He came back the following Tuesday, and this time he brought a man from his father's outfit, a broad fellow who stood by the horses and didn't speak, but was there in the way that extra men are sometimes there, as punctuation. Boyd came onto the porch again with his practiced smile and talked about his father's offer with a little more insistence this time, and Bessie said no with a little more firmness, and they went back and forth in that way for a few minutes before Clement came around the barn and walked to the porch with an easy stride and stood at the foot of the steps and said, "Miss Bancroft said no, Mr. Crenshaw. I'd take her at her word." Boyd looked at him. "Who are you?" "A friend," Clement said, in the quiet voice of a man who doesn't need to be loud to be heard. "This is none of your business." "She made it mine," Clement said, "same as she made the rest of this place mine for now. So I'd appreciate it if you'd give her answer the respect it deserves." Boyd studied him for a long moment, that calibrating look of a man weighing options, and then his eyes moved to Bessie and back to Clement, and something in what he saw seemed to close the calculation. "My father will come himself," Boyd said. "He's welcome to visit," Bessie said. Same answer. Boyd left and the broad man left with him, and when they were gone, Bessie looked at Clement and said, "Thank you," and he said, "You had it handled," which was true, and which made her like him even more. Dale Crenshaw did come himself, the following Friday, and he was a different thing from his son, older, quieter, with the manner of a man who had earned what he had through genuine work and knew the value of it. He sat on Bessie's porch and drank the coffee she offered and talked about the land with a rancher's eye, and he made his offer, which was generous enough that she acknowledged it as such. And then she declined it, and he looked at her for a moment with something that was close to respect and said, "Your mother was the same way, wouldn't sell me so much as an inch." A pause. "I respected her for it too." "Thank you, Mr. Crenshaw," she said. He stood and nodded at Clement, who had been sitting on the porch railing through the whole conversation, quiet and present. "You're Hartwell," Dale said. "Garza's man." "Yes, sir." "You bought this place at the auction." "And gave it back," Dale said, with the note of a man who is confirming something he already knows. "That's right." Dale Crenshaw was quiet for a moment, looking between them with the level gaze of a man who reads land and people with the same practiced eye. "You have yourself a good property here, Miss Bancroft," he said, "and it sounds like you have the right people on it." He put his hat on. "I won't trouble you again." He rode away, and Bessie and Clement sat on the porch in the quiet that followed, and after a while Clement said, "I think that's the end of that particular chapter," and Bessie said, "I hope so," and poured more coffee. June came in warm and good, and the farm was beginning to look like itself again, like the place Bessie remembered from childhood, tended and living and full of purpose. The garden was producing. She had bought 3 chickens from Mrs. Prewitt's surplus and put them in the repaired coop, and they were already laying. The barn needed new planking on the east side, and she and Clement worked on it one full Saturday, which turned into a longer day than either of them intended, and by evening they were sitting on the tailgate of the wagon with cold water and the satisfaction of something built, and Bessie realized that she had not been this content, physically tired and quietly content, in years. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "What would you have done?" "If I'd been the kind of woman who just took the deed and said thank you and never asked any questions," he thought about it, "I'd have ridden on like I said I would. And that would have been all right with you." A pause. "It would have been what was right," he said. "Whether it would have been all right is a different question." She looked at him. The evening sun was low and soft, and everything was gold, the barn and the pasture and the cottonwood trees and him. "I'm glad I asked questions," she said. "So am I," he said, and this time when she looked at him, she didn't look away. He leaned toward her very slightly, or she leaned toward him, or they both moved at the same time in the way that sometimes happens when two people have been circling a thing long enough that the circling finally just becomes the thing. And he kissed her, softly and carefully, and she kissed him back, and it was nothing like a sudden thing. It was exactly like the steady accumulation of all the mornings on the porch and the afternoons in the garden, and the long, easy talks, and the silence that was never uncomfortable, all of it arriving at this point as naturally as water running downhill. He pulled back and looked at her, and the amber brown of his eyes was warm and searching and a little uncertain, and she thought that the uncertainty on his face was one of the most honest things she had ever seen. "Bessie," he said, and her name in his voice was something different from how anyone else said it. "Yes," she said, which was an answer to the question he hadn't quite asked yet. He exhaled, something releasing in his whole frame, and he reached up and pushed a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that made her close her eyes for just a moment. "I wasn't planning on any of this," he said. "I know," she said. "Neither was I. Is that a problem?" She looked at him. "Clement, you came 3 days out of your way to put something right for a stranger. You gave back $1,000 because it was the correct thing to do. You set a porch post and glazed windows and hung a shutter and brought me a rosemary plant, and you listen when I talk about my mother, and you never once made me feel like I owed you anything." A pause. "The problem would be if I didn't feel the way I feel." "How do you feel?" he said quietly. "Like I want you to stay," she said. "Not for repairs. For good." He looked at her for a long moment in the golden evening, and then he said, "Then I'll stay," as simply as he said everything, as simply as he had said he would give back the land, with the full weight of a man who means what he says. Dora Calloway's reaction when Bessie told her was to set down every ribbon she was holding and say, "Finally," with a satisfaction so profound it was almost musical. "You knew," Bessie said. "Bessie, I knew in the millinery back room the day he sat across that table from you. The man rode 3 days. Men don't ride 3 days for strangers. He said he did it because something sat wrong." "Something sat right is what sat," Dora said firmly, and picked her ribbons back up. "Clement told Roberto Garza that he'd be staying on indefinitely, and Garza, who was a man of few words and great perspicacity, said, 'I know,' and kept brushing the horse he was working on. He took his meals more regularly at the farmhouse, and on the evenings he stayed late. They sat on the porch with the lamp lit and the moths coming to the light, and she read to him from the books her mother had kept on the shelf, a novel, a book of poetry, a history of Texas that her father had ordered from a bookstore in Austin when Bessie was small. He read to her sometimes in return in that even, unhurried voice, and she sat and listened to it and thought she could listen to it for a very long time. In early July, a letter came from Thomas in San Antonio. He was engaged to Harriet. They would be married in October. He wanted Bessie to come. And then in his careful bookkeeper's hand, "I have heard something from a cousin of Mrs. Prewitt's who passed through San Antonio that there is a man at Cottonwood Creek who is a good man and that you are not managing alone. I hope this is true. Tell me if it is true." Bessie wrote back, "It is true. His name is Clement Hartwell and he is the best kind of man. You will meet him in October if you don't have any objections to me bringing him to your wedding." Thomas wrote back in 4 days, which was a record. "Bring him immediately." The summer was long and good and full. The farm was producing well enough that Bessie was selling surplus at the market in town on Saturdays, and Mr. Huang had agreed to take some of her preserves and dried herbs on consignment, which gave her a steady small income on top of what the farm itself generated. She was learning what she hadn't known before, what she could carry, what she needed help with, what she could build. She thought about her mother a lot in this learning, and about the ways in which she was her mother's daughter and the ways in which she was something new. Clement was building something new too. He had been saving, and Roberto Garza, who knew everything that happened in Harlan County and its surrounds, mentioned one evening that a small horse breeding operation about 20 miles east was looking for a partner with skill and capital. Clement went out to look at it, took Bessie with him, and they rode the property together the way they had ridden her property back in April, and she asked the same good questions he asked, and he was aware of the symmetry, and so was she. "What do you think?" he asked on the ride back. "I think it's a solid opportunity," she said. "The stock is good, the land is manageable, and you're the best hand with horses that Roberto Garza has said out loud that he's ever seen, which from Roberto is equivalent to about 40 words of praise from anyone else." He laughed, that full, warm laugh. "You think I should do it?" "I think you should do whatever you want with your own life," she said. "But yes, I think it suits you." He looked at her for a moment as they rode. "It's 20 miles, he said. "I know where it is. That's a long ride every morning." "It is," she said. He was quiet for another moment, and she let him be quiet because she knew what he was working out. "I would want to come every morning," he said, "which means 20 miles isn't practical long-term unless," he stopped. "Unless," she prompted. He turned his horse so they were facing each other on the trail, and he looked at her with all that direct, careful attention, and said, "Bessie, I would like to ask you to marry me, which is a thing I'd like to ask you entirely apart from the question of the horse operation and the 20 miles, because I don't want you to think I'm asking for logistical reasons." She looked at him. The summer afternoon was bright and warm, and the trail was dappled with the shade of live oaks, and he was looking at her with that expression she had been coming to know for months now, the full, honest gaze of a man whose attention was the steadiest thing she'd encountered. "Are you sure there's no logistical component?" she said. "I am certain," he said, "that if you say no, I will still want to ride 20 miles every morning, and I will simply be a very tired man." She laughed, and the sound of her own laughter surprised her, a little full and free and certain. "Yes," she said. "Clement Hartwell, yes." He reached across the narrow gap between their horses and took her hand, and held it in his warm, calloused grip, and they rode back toward Cottonwood Creek like that, side by side with their hands bridging the space between them, and the summer light came through the live oaks in long gold shafts, and Bessie thought that this was what it felt like to arrive somewhere. They were married in September, 3 weeks before Thomas's wedding, because Bessie's letter describing the engagement had produced a response from Thomas that said simply, "Do it before October so I can celebrate both," and Harriet agrees. The wedding was in the church, the one with the peeling white paint that Reverend Marsh had been meaning to repaint for 3 years, and Bessie wore a dress that Dora had made for her out of a pale blue cotton that was the color of clear sky on a cold morning, with pearl buttons down the front that had been her mother's, and which she had asked Dora to incorporate specifically. She carried the late-blooming roses from the front fence, the deep red ones, the French variety she could never pronounce, because it seemed right, because her mother's roses were blooming on her wedding day, and that felt like something. The church was full. All of Harlan Creek came, because small towns come to weddings the way they come to everything that matters, and this wedding had a story that most of them knew, the auction and the deed and the man who'd given it back. And they came with the particular satisfaction of people who want to see a good story end well. Clement stood at the front of the church in a good dark coat and a white shirt, and the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. When Bessie came down the aisle on the arm of old Mr. Finn, who had volunteered for the honor with such genuine enthusiasm that she hadn't had the heart to refuse him, Clement's face did the thing it did when something moved him. A quiet settling, a stillness that was not absence but presence, more present than most people's most extravagant expressions. Reverend Marsh, whose discomfort at the auction had been visible enough that Bessie had since forgiven him without his knowing he needed forgiving, conducted the ceremony with a warmth and care that made Bessie think better of him. He spoke about building things together, and about the kind of love that shows itself in action before it shows itself in words, and Bessie felt the accuracy of that description like a hand pressed against her chest. She and Clement spoke their vows to each other, looking directly into each other's faces, because they were both people who meant what they said and who looked straight when they said it. And when he slid the simple gold band onto her finger, a ring he had ordered from a jeweler in the county seat and which was plain and honest like everything about him, she felt it settle there as though it had always belonged. Dora cried, which surprised exactly no one. Roberto Garza stood in the back row and did not cry, but he shook Clement's hand afterward with both of his, which in Roberto's vocabulary was equivalent to a sonnet. The wedding supper was at the farmhouse, and they had a proper one. Mrs. Garrett and Dora and a half-dozen other women had conspired on it for 2 weeks, and there was more food than 20 people could eat, and they ate it anyway. And there was fiddle music from a pair of brothers who played at barn dances and who played at this one with particular energy. And the evening went long into the September dark, with lanterns strung from the porch and the smell of the roses and the sound of laughter over the music of the creek. At some point in the middle of the evening, Bessie found a moment's quiet at the edge of the yard, looking out at the pasture in the dark, and she felt Clement come to stand beside her with the particular sense she had developed of his presence, the warmth and steadiness of him. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm very all right," she said. "What are you thinking?" She looked out at the land, at the dark shapes of the cottonwood trees against the September sky, at the land her father had claimed and her mother had defended, and she had nearly lost and had been given back. "I'm thinking about my mother," she said, "and that I wish she were here." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood for a while looking at the land together. "She knows," he said quietly. "You believe that. I think the people we love carry forward," he said. "In us, in the things they built, in the roses," a pause, "in the way you stood at that auction." Bessie felt the prick of tears that she had promised not to have in public, but there was no public here, just the two of them in the dark at the edge of their own land, and she let them come briefly and quietly, and then she straightened, which was what she always did, and she turned and looked up at him. "We should go back to our guests," she said. He smiled, and it was a full smile, unheld and warm, the smile she had been working toward for months with her questions and her porch mornings and her honesty. "We should," he said, and took her hand, and they went back to the light and the music and the people who had come to celebrate them. October came, and they made the trip to San Antonio for Thomas's wedding, the two of them riding the stage with a worn leather bag each, Bessie in her good traveling clothes and Clement with a new hat he had bought from Dora's millinery at Bessie's quiet insistence. Thomas met them at the stage station, and the first thing he did was grip Clement's hand with both of his, the way Roberto had, and say, "I know what you did. I'm glad you did it," which was Thomas's way of saying everything he needed to say, and Clement received it as such. Harriet was a small, bright woman with quick eyes and opinions about everything, and she adopted Bessie in the instant they met in the way that certain women adopt other women as sisters, completely and without negotiation. She pulled Bessie aside at the reception and said, "He is extraordinary, your husband. Thomas told me the whole story. You are both extraordinary." And Bessie said, "Harriet, I think I like you enormously," and Harriet said, "Of course you do." Thomas and Harriet were married on a warm October Saturday, and Bessie stood at the front of the small church next to her new sister-in-law's family and felt the particular fullness of a good day, the way it fills up to the edges. Coming home to Cottonwood Creek after, she felt it again, the sense of arriving somewhere. The lane under the cottonwood trees, the house with the level porch and the glazed windows and the rosemary in its pot in the corner, the roses climbing the front fence in the last of their autumn blossoming. Clement tied the horses and she carried the bag up the steps, and she unlocked the front door, and they walked into the kitchen that smelled like wood and cedar, and the dried herbs she kept in bunches from the ceiling. And it was home. He had moved the last of his things from the livery room in the weeks before the wedding, and they had arranged the house together, combining his few things and her many things into something that looked like both of them, which meant it looked like a real house, full of use and meaning. His coat hung on the peg by the door. His boots were at the bottom of the stairs. His coffee cup was the blue one on the second hook. They were building the horse operation that winter. He had partnered with the man east of town. His name was Aldous Briggs, a quiet widower who knew horses and wanted a working partner more than another employee, and the arrangement was working well. He rode out there 3 days a week and was home the other days. And on the days he was gone, Bessie ran the farm with the efficient self-sufficiency she had been developing all her life. And on the days he was home, they worked together, and both arrangements were good. The winter was mild, and the spring of 1883 came in early and green, and in March Bessie sat down across from Clement at the kitchen table and looked at him with an expression he had learned to read as something she was arranging into words. "What is it?" he said. "We're going to have a baby," she said. The stillness that came over him was different from all his other kinds of stillness. This one broke almost immediately into something warm and unguarded, something she had not quite seen on his face before, and he was out of his chair before she'd finished processing the change in his expression, and he came around the table and put his hands on her face and looked at her with so much openness that she felt the full force of it like sun after a long winter. "Are you sure?" he said. "Mrs. Garrett is sure," she said, because she had gone to Mrs. Garrett first, because Mrs. Garrett had brought more babies into Harlan Creek than anyone else, and her certainty was not something to be questioned. He kissed her forehead and her cheek and then her mouth, and held her face in his hands, and she reached up and put her hands over his, and they stayed like that in the kitchen, with the morning light coming through the new glazed window that he had hung on the first working day they'd spent together, and everything was exactly as it should be. She wrote to Thomas, and Thomas's letter back was 2 pages of exclamation and underlines, and the news that Harriet was also expecting, and they would be cousins, and this was the best news Thomas had received in his entire life, and Harriet added a postscript that said the same in more measured but equally sincere terms. Dora's response was to close the millinery for the afternoon and bring over a cake, which she presented at the farmhouse door with the announcement, "I am going to make the best infant clothing this county has ever seen, and I don't want to hear a word against it." Bessie said she wouldn't dream of a word against it, and they sat on the porch with the cake and the good April air, and Dora talked about fabric and Bessie listened with half her attention, and gave the other half to the particular contentment of sitting on this porch with her friend, and the smell of her mother's roses coming on the spring breeze. The summer of 1883 was hot and long, and Bessie moved through it with the somewhat ungraceful determination of a woman who refuses to reduce her activities despite being large with child, which drove Clement to a quietly constant vigilance that he tried to make unobtrusive and mostly failed, and which she found equally exasperating and deeply touching. He did not tell her what to do because he knew better, but he appeared with assistance at the exact moment it was needed with a frequency that could only be attributed to attention so careful it bordered on prescience. "You're watching me," she told him one August afternoon. "I'm farming," he said innocently from the direction of the bean poles. "You've been at those same bean poles for 45 minutes. A pause. They need a lot of attention." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of a man whose guilelessness is genuine and whose guilt is entirely genuine. "I love you," she said, because she had said it for the first time in May and had not regretted saying it for a single day since, and because in this particular moment it was both a declaration and a very gentle verdict. His expression did the quiet settling thing, the presence thing. "I love you," he said, with all the plainness and all the weight that she had come to know was exactly what he meant. Their son was born in September of 1883 in the farmhouse at Cottonwood Creek, delivered by Mrs. Garrett with Dora assisting and Clement outside on the porch, where he had been politely but firmly directed, and where he had been absolutely useless for the duration. The baby was healthy and loud and had dark hair, and Bessie thought, the exact quality of attention in his new small face that his father had in his grown one. They named him James Clara Hartwell. James for Clement's father in Missouri, and Clara for Bessie's mother, given as a middle name in the manner she had heard of from a woman in the county seat, and which felt exactly right. James Clara Hartwell arrived in the world at noon on a September day, and Clement came into the room and looked at him and at Bessie, and his face was something new, something that Bessie thought she would spend years learning the precise vocabulary of, and was glad she would have the time. "Hello," Clement said to the baby quietly. "He can't say hello back yet," Bessie said from the pillow. "I know," he said. "I'm introducing myself." He sat on the edge of the bed and held out his hand, and the baby's impossibly small fingers closed around his finger with the reflexive grip of the newly arrived, and Clement looked at that for a long moment and then up at Bessie. "Thank you," he said. "We did this together," she said. "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She reached up and put her hand on the side of his face, and he turned into it slightly, the way he always did. And outside the window the September afternoon was going gold, and the cottonwood trees were beginning to turn, and the creek ran over its stones in the unbroken voice it had always had and would always have along this land. The years that followed were full. Not without difficulty. The winter of 1884 was hard, and the cattle fever that moved through the county took 2 of their horses before they could quarantine the rest, and Bessie lost 3 weeks of garden to an early frost that year, and there were ordinary struggles of the kind that belong to anyone who works the land and doesn't pretend otherwise. But they were built for difficulty, both of them, in the way that people are built for it who have met it early and decided it would not own them. James grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's direct gaze, and who by age 2 was following Clement around the property with the focus of a small apprentice. He did not, at 2, add anything useful to the farming enterprise, but he added considerably to the quality of it, and Bessie watched him toddle after his father across the yard with a feeling in her chest that was too large for a single word. In the fall of 1885, their second child arrived, a girl this time, who had Bessie's brown hair and an opinion about everything from the first week, and whom they named Eleanor after Clement's mother and called Ellie for the economy of it. Ellie arrived in the world with the decisive energy of someone who has things to do, which Bessie recognized and welcomed, and which was somewhat exhausting at all hours. Thomas and Harriet came from San Antonio with their own son, a small, serious child named Samuel, and they spent 2 weeks at the farm in October of that year, which was the loudest and most populated Cottonwood Creek had been since Bessie's childhood, and which she loved with her whole heart. Thomas pulled her aside one morning while Clement and Harriet were managing the combined chaos of 3 children in the yard, and he looked at her with the earnest directness that had always been his way and said, "Are you happy, Bess?" "Thomas," she said, "look at this." She gestured out the kitchen window at the yard, Clement on one knee in the dirt showing James and Samuel something in the dust, Harriet sitting on the porch with Ellie on her lap, the farm around them all full and producing and alive. "I know," Thomas said. "I just wanted to hear you say it. I am the happiest I have ever been," she said, "and I'm fairly sure it's going to keep getting better." Thomas nodded and hugged her, and they went outside into the October morning that smelled like turning leaves and creek water and the last of the autumn roses. Clement had never formally sold his share in the horse operation, but in 1886 he and Aldous Briggs expanded it into something that generated enough income that Clement was able to take on 2 men to help, which freed him for the farm in a way that felt like a luxury after years of early mornings and late nights managing both. The Cottonwood Creek property itself was prospering in a way that Bessie's mother would have recognized as the culmination of what she had begun. The garden, the orchard, the cattle they'd added to the south pasture, the small enterprise of selling horses that were trained on the property and sold to buyers who came from 3 counties. In the spring of 1887, Bessie walked the whole perimeter of the land the way she had walked it on that first afternoon with Clement in the long April light, 5 years after the auction that had threatened to take it all away. She walked it alone, early in the morning while the children were still sleeping, and Clement was at the horse operation, with the particular intention of a woman who wants to know something by herself before she shares it. She walked the fence line in the new grass, and stood at the creek bend where the big rock was and listened to the water, and walked the south pasture where the cattle were coming in from the night, and stood in the apple orchard that was blossoming white against the morning sky. She walked past the spot where she had stood on that first day after the auction, and felt the hollowness of the gavel's sound in her chest, and she stood there now, and felt what had replaced it, something solid and warm and full of breath. Her mother had planted this land. Her father had claimed it. She had fought to keep it and lost it and had it handed back to her by a man who had ridden 3 days on a feeling that something needed to be put right. And she had built her whole life here since. And the life was good. And the land was hers. And the man who had given it back was also hers, and she was his. And they had built something together that was more than either of them had been alone. She stood in the spring morning and breathed the smell of the land cedar and red dirt and water and blossom, and she said, out loud, quietly, to no one visible and to someone she believed could hear, "Look what we made, Mama." When she got back to the house, Clement was in the kitchen, which meant he had come back early from the operation, and James was at the table eating biscuits with the serious focus of a 4-year-old who considers biscuits an important responsibility, and Ellie was in her chair conducting a conversation with a wooden spoon, and it was loud and warm and smelled of coffee and everything good. Clement looked at her over his coffee cup and saw what was on her face, and his expression did its quiet, warm settling. "How was the walk?" he said. "Good," she said. "Come outside with me for a minute." They stood on the porch, just the two of them, in the April morning that was cool and bright, and she looked at the front fence where the roses were coming into their spring bud, and she thought of her mother's hands on these same canes and her mother's voice on 100 mornings in this same yard. "I have been thinking," she said, "about what my mother would think of all this." "What do you conclude?" he said. "I think she would think I did well," Bessie said. "In most ways. I think she would think I did very well in the most important one." He looked at her and she looked back, and everything that had passed between them since that April day in 1882, the deed and the back room and the mornings on the porch and the rosemary plant and the long rides and the work and the laughter and the baby and the years, was present in the looking, part of what they were to each other, the accumulated thing. "She would be right," he said. Bessie took his hand and held it in both of hers, the hand she had first shaken across a small table in a millinery back room, the hand she had held across a horse's back on a summer trail, the hand that wore the plain gold band she had put there on a September day in a church with peeling white paint. The creek ran, the roses budded, the children were loud inside, and the April sky was the exact blue of the dress she'd worn to the auction, and the land stretched out from the porch in all its 240 acres of red earth and cedar and grass, free and clear, hers and his and theirs. She was exactly where she needed to be, on ground she had nearly lost, with a man who had ridden 3 days because something sat wrong, standing in the morning of a good life that was still being built. "Come on," she said, squeezing his hand. "Our children are unsupervised with a wooden spoon." He laughed full and warm, and they went inside together, and the door closed behind them on the April morning, and the cottonwood trees moved in the soft spring wind, and the creek kept on, and the roses opened one by one along the fence that her mother had planted and her daughter had kept, in the yard of the farmhouse at Cottonwood Creek, in the spring of 1887, where everything that had been broken was made whole again.